Welcome, Mr. Beach. Or is that Bond? I'm a little confused.
Hello friends, I'm Konrad and welcome to Bad Guy Breakdowns, the series where we look at the most iconic villains to grace the silver screen. Let's get into the villainy. James Bond. We've talked about him before, and while there are some truly excellent Bond movies, I think it's fair to say that there are at least as many bad ones as good. Case in point, by the mid-2000s, Eon Productions had, to use an industry term, done fucked up Bond.
With the drugs they were giving you, you wouldn't know what you did or didn't say.
GoldenEye ruled, Tomorrow Never Dies was pretty good, but by Die Another Day, the British super spy was on an undeniable, inexorable decline into abject silliness. I mean, look at this shit. Look how bad this looks. More like CGI Another Day, right? Because these special effects need more work, and they should have spent more time. Barbara Broccoli and producer Michael Wilson had acquired the rights to adapt Ian Fleming's original James Bond novel Casino Royale in 2000, after over 30 years of legal back and forth.
It seemed like this was the great opportunity. The opportunity had been missed all the way along, and we could finally make Casino Royale the way it should be.
With the series floundering creatively, if not financially, they made the decision in 2004 to pull the plug on Brosnan's run and restart the series with the origin story of the character and a new, younger actor. Cue 2 years of searching for the man to step into the dinner jacket, a task that would eventually yield up Daniel Craig, an actor who rose to prominence in the 1997 British TV miniseries The Ice House, before appearing in movies like Tomb Raider, Road to Perdition, Munich and Layer Cake. He was, it's fair to say, relatively well known at the point that they hired him. However, the same cannot be said of the man who would be playing opposite him as the villain Le Chiffre, Mads Mikkelsen. In 2006, Mikkelsen hadn't made the leap from European cinema yet, but was nonetheless pretty experienced, having starred in the first 2 Pusher movies directed by fellow Dane Nicholas Winding Refn, as well as many others. And being something of an unknown actually helped the character somewhat. Le Chiffre isn't an over-the-top villain, he's essentially an accountant to the world's terrorists. His role in Casino Royale is to serve as Bond's intellectual equal without ever really presenting himself as the man in charge of anything. He's a stepping stone to a wider international network of criminals, so being understated was important.
Someone talked.
The plot would revolve around Le Chiffre losing a bunch of money and staging a high-stakes poker game to recoup these losses, and Mikkelsen would wind up being the perfect choice for a man who is incredibly desperate but masks that desperation with arrogance, bringing a prickly demeanour in his performance that really serves to underline that this man is annoyed by his situation, despite it being his own fault, and thinks the act of solving it is beneath him. He's the guy who sits next to you at work and complains about how he deserves better because he's smarter than everyone else in the office, but he'll never be promoted because he can't talk to another human without ranking his favourite Babylon 5 characters. In a movie where the producers were desperate to give audiences the feeling of a definitive break from what had come before, a villain like that was exactly what they needed. A bad guy whose goal wasn't world domination or a fucking space laser or something, he was just a man with a list of terrorist clients who could be flipped and squeezed for that information. It was back to proper spy stuff for the first time in decades, and in the spirit of returning to their roots, director Martin Campbell, who had helmed Brosnan's debut GoldenEye, was brought back to guide Craig's version of the character to the big screen. However, he was well aware that this was going to require a different tone to his first Bond movie. Gone was much of the bombast, the one-liners were scaled back, and Bond became a much more realistic character in Neil Purvis and Robert Wade's screenplay. An individual whose apathy towards violence borders on the sociopathic and whose misogyny is challenged rather than celebrated. Bond had, frankly, become antiquated and goofy. He'd been left behind by a world of action cinema that had moved on to the likes of The Bourne Identity and the influential French movie District 13. Movies with grittier characters where the action sequences were hard-hitting and brutal. To be relevant again, Bond needed to speak to that audience, and he would do so through kinetic action sequences and a simpler kind of plot than had come before. And what's easy to miss in this Bond rebranding is that often the reason these movies ended up in an escalating arms race of ludicrous plots is because a scenery-chewing villain with an off-the-wall scheme was frequently used as a tool to paper over the cracks of a main character who lacked any real depth and an often shocking lack of cinematic craft. Yes, I'm talking about you, 90% of Roger Moore's Bond movie catalogue. So essentially, in choosing to scale back the sillier aspects of Bond, they were creating a vacuum in their movies that would need filling. The assumption was that the newfound focus on legitimate-looking action would go some way to doing this, and they were right. But in making a movie where your villain and their plan are, by design, very understated, you inadvertently ask a huge amount of the actor playing the role. How was Mikkelsen going to keep Le Chiffre relevant when he couldn't fall back on the staple of overacting?
What's true is that in 48 hours, you and I will have more money than God.
And the answer, simply put, is by being one hell of a charismatic performer, creating a villain as memorable as any in Craig's Bond films, and arguably among the best in the series as a whole, with relatively little to work with. Elevating the fairly muted character on the page into a nervous, irritable coward with a mean streak. And, to be fair to the script, a little bit of arch-villainry in his back pocket too.
Weeping blood comes merely from a derangement of the tear duct, my dear General. Nothing sinister.
One of the things about Le Chiffre that has always struck me as particularly challenging for Mikkelsen is how little we actually know about the character. M speculates that he's of Albanian descent and a mathematical genius and chess prodigy who acts as banker to the world's terrorists. But that's about it, to be honest. Not a huge amount to work with. Some actors may love inhabiting a blank canvas of a role that allows them some freedom to create the character in their own image, but it's undoubtedly more work for them. If I were Mikkelsen, I'd be asking for a tabula rasa my salary, if you know what I'm saying. Thanks, Judy. In the novel and earlier versions of the movie, he was referred to as the Digit or the Cipher. Both fairly on-the-nose allusions to his position as a financier and his muted, hard-to-read personality. I mean, they might as well have called him Bankman, Mr. Numbers, or the Bluffmaster General. But I know what you're thinking. Here I am fawning over Mikkelsen's ability to bring the character to life with not much guidance when he already had been played on screen not once, but twice. First by Peter Lorre of M and Casablanca fame in the made-for-TV adaptation of the same name in 1954.
Well, it looks like you're as lucky as they say. Eh? Oh, you're a legend, old boy. Card Sense Jimmy Bond, they call you. I knew you right away.
Playing opposite Barry Nelson as wait a second, Card Sense Jimmy Bond? What in the world? Jimmy? That's a little overfamiliar. Anyway, Lorre played all sorts of villains. He had a face for it, let's be honest. And his performance as Le Chiffre is very good, but it's definitely of the scenery-chewing variety.
Oh, you're an obstinate man, Mr. Bond. But I think you've had enough, huh?
And it doesn't really capture the depth of emotion that was required of Mikkelsen, not least because, frankly, TV movies in the 50s just didn't have the same kind of expectations of acting that Hollywood blockbusters do. And if Lorre played the character as just about the right side of hammy, then I don't even know how to describe the performance of Orson Welles, who would take on the role in the 1967 spy movie spoof, sort of a proto-Austin Powers, except, you know, not good. This time around, Le Chiffre still works as a financier for SMERSH, a communist counterintelligence agency, or the villains, as any movie made during, after, or indeed before the Cold War will tell you, and still loses a bunch of money playing Baccarat against James Bond, this time with Peter Sellers in the role. Seriously, I do not understand how this film is as bad as it is. Look at that cast. Never is Wells' campy performance ever more at odds with what would come after him than in the scene where Bond is captured, where Laurie and Mickelson would both opt for good old-fashioned torture to get the money back from their prisoner. Wells' incarnation of the character would subject his nemesis to some kind of mind control device that placed him in a nightmare with, I think those might be Scott's guards, and that's definitely Peter O'Toole. But they march around him for a bit until Vesper Lynd guns them all down and breaks the illusion. It's a weird film. And not overly faithful to the Fleming novel, unsurprisingly. So I think it's fair to say that, on balance, Mickelson wasn't inheriting a lot of character work that he could actually use when he came to the role. It's arguable that some of the slimy performance of Laurie made it into his own, but unless there was a cut scene featuring Le Chiffre performing magic tricks to distract Bond from the poker game that I'm unaware of, the Orson Welles iteration was likely more of a hindrance than a help. He also wasn't even first choice for the role, a fact that seems staggering in retrospect given the strength of his performance. During an interview with Entertainment Weekly in 2021, casting director Debbie McWilliams said, "Mads Mikkelsen was not in Casino Royale at all until the person who we originally wanted didn't go. I'd kept my eye on him, although to my mind he wasn't entirely right for the part because Le Chiffre, by his own name, is meant to be French, but once our French actor was not going to be cast, we were in Prague and by pure chance so was Mads Mikkelsen, and so I grabbed him and got him in." Nowhere does she mention who this French actor was, so I'm just going to wildly speculate that it was one of Jean Dujardin, Vincent Cassel, or old dependable himself, Gérard Depardieu. It's also sort of adorable hearing that anyone casting a Bond villain had the thought, this man isn't really from where the character is from, maybe we should consider that. As if this isn't the film series that casts Christopher Lee as a Cuban and Christopher Walken as an East German. Although that level of consideration certainly speaks to the new tone the people involved with making Casino Royale were hoping to strike with it. We've already spoken about how Mikkelsen's performance was central to capturing that tone and still keeping the main conflict of the movie interesting, so I won't belabour the point, but it bears repeating that Casino Royale's success as a movie rested at least partially on his performance, and its quality is, as such, a testament to the quality of the character he created. As is tradition for Bond movie bad guy breakdowns, we can't really start anywhere else but in analysing the plot through the lens of the villain's plan, he says halfway through the script of this video. Look, just ignore that, alright? Imagine this is the start. We also need to judge the tools he has at his disposal. While Bond begins the movie murdering corrupt government officials, Le Chiffre spends it receiving his latest investment from generic African warlord Stephen Obano. Here we meet the nebulously evil Mr. White, a character who won't be all that important until the end of the movie, which is really just an elaborate setup for Quantum of Solace. He's the face of an as of yet unnamed criminal organisation, and a pretty big stickler for not losing all of your money through bad investments and then trying to win it back by gambling, a stance the international financial world could have done with in 2008. Am I equating the people involved with the mortgage market crash to violent criminals? Of course not. It's just a funny coincidence. What a funny coincidence it is! Anyway, Le Chiffre plans to carry out a bombing that will tank a certain stock which he plans to short with his investment fund. And first up on the roll call of villainous henchmen is Malaka the Bomb Maker, played by Sebastian Foucan, one of the people credited with inventing the sport of freerunning.
We thought it would be an exciting thing to introduce.
When people talk about Craig's Bond feeling different, the opening action scene of Casino Royale is often one of the first things that comes to mind. The physicality and jaw-dropping stunts of this chase sequence are like nothing the series had seen before. Roger Moore's bones would have literally shattered to dust if he even read the script for this scene. And yet, in my eyes, this remains an evolution rather than a revolution of the Bond formula. The big bad guy has rarely been an ultra-physical sort, normally having one or more henchmen at their service to do the rough and tumble. And this is just an escalation of that. You can trace a through line from Robert Shaw beating the ever-living shit out of Sean Connery on a train to this. The value of that continuity is that Casino Royale ends up maintaining the broad structure and appearance of a Bond movie while still feeling completely fresh.
Anything, because unless you get involved with something like this, you don't know what what it takes to make a movie like this.
And in keeping with other Bond movie traditions, there of course has to be a pretty stupid breadcrumb trail of clues to follow from one henchman to the next. In this case, a text message reading the word ellipses on the bomb maker's phone after Bond has executed him in an embassy, something that M isn't thrilled about.
Christ, I miss the Cold War.
After Bond is done tracking the ellipsis text message from Malacca to Demetrius' phone in the Bahamas, he beats him in poker, which was honestly just an act of spite, seduces his wife, then follows him to Miami where Alex is setting up a replacement bomb maker to blow up a prototype plane that'll send the stock of a fictional company Skyfleet tumbling. How does he do this? Well, of course, by using a hard-to-trace form of communication like calling from a payphone or a face-to-face... Jesus Christ, did you just send a text from your phone too, Alex?
Are you talking to me on a cellular phone? I don't know you. Who is this? Don't come here. I'm hanging up the phone. Prank caller! Prank caller!
How on earth has this ring of criminals gone undetected for this long? Have none of you seen The Wire? Use a burner at least, for fuck's sake.
Oh, indeed.
Demetrios gets stabbed and new explodey man Carlos jumps into the story as the next evil bastard Bond needs to follow. Like Tarzan swinging from vine to vine, except also murdering each vine as he leaves it. There's a pretty phenomenal action sequence here that I can't really do justice to with words, except to say that after failing to drive a fuel truck with a bomb seemingly attached to it into the Skyfleet prototype, causing Le Chiffre to lose his financial ass in the failed stock gamble, Carlos loses his literal ass when the bomb goes off attached to his trousers. That's a rough day at the office for Le Chiffre and a devastating dry cleaning bill for the police officer Carlos stole those clothes from. Bond has sort of stumbled his way blindly into an international financial conspiracy on raw instinct at this point, forcing Le Chiffre to surface for air like a big sweaty submarine. And this is where Casino Royale shifts. They've set the tone with the action, now it's time to see if this new Craig guy and Mikkelsen can hang when the movie needs to rest on their performances. Le Chiffre and Bond meet a little over an hour into the movie with both well aware of who the other is. Bond has cost Le Chiffre over $100 million and several henchmen of varying competency at this point. He's taken a lot of losses and it does make him look a bit weak. Now, in your average Bond movie this wouldn't matter as much because the villain's appearance of strength relative to the hero isn't all that important when they're pointing a Death Star at Saturn, or whatever it is they're up to. But here, nothing could be more crucial. We are heading into an hour of people playing poker. The character dynamics between the villain and the hero are what this section of movie rests on. And more than that, this sequence of scenes contains the most complex writing and acting of Bond in, I'm going to say, ever. Up until this point, we've established that Bond is a blunt but effective object, but in Montenegro he will become vulnerable for the first time, both as a result of his softening emotions for Vesper Lynd and Le Chiffre outthinking him. So to make his vulnerability seem real, we have to reaffirm the strength of Le Chiffre's position relative to Bond's. Now, they could have done this by suddenly revealing that Monsieur Digit was an expert in karate, or something like that. It would have been stupid, but they could have done it. But instead, the story wisely opts to maintain the peril that the villain is in while inserting Bond as a buffer between Le Chiffre and that peril. Essentially, every threat that exists to Le Chiffre is mitigated by someone else who wants to keep him alive, Bond or Felix Leiter usually, before Bond is then subjected to that same threat to highlight the differences between them, as well as capturing a sense of the hero overcoming the odds. So a great example of this is in the fight scene in the stairwell after Stephen Urbano has threatened to chop off Le Chiffre's partner's arm, something he is too scared to do anything about. Whereas in the ensuing fight, Bond is in a commanding position until Vesper Lynd is threatened, at which point he hurls himself into harm's way to protect her. This is brilliantly accentuated by Martin Campbell's choice to have Bond fighting from the left, literally uphill after he sacrifices a position of dominance in the struggle to help the woman he loves. That's characterization within an action scene rather than action for the sake of action. And not just for the hero, but for the villain whose lack of action is now contrasted starkly against the hero's choices. Also, I love this scene because when they fall down the centre of the stairwell, they clearly land on a dummy. This idea of Bond growing out of the nastier aspects of his character to contrast him against Le Chiffre is really highlighted in the moment where he is busted out of the poker game. And there's a lot to talk about here.
You changed your shirt, Mr. Bond. I hope our little game isn't causing you to perspire.
First and foremost, I usually rag on Bond villains for having overcomplicated plans that invariably fail when something goes wrong. But here, Le Chiffre's plan just works. He just wins, because he's smarter than Bond. If it weren't for CIA agent Felix Leiter intervening, this movie would have ended very differently. And we need to bear in mind this idea of Bond being saved by someone else for a change, because it doesn't happen often and it's really important both here and later. But so much of what makes this moment perfect comes down to the dynamic between the hero and the villain. Bond's arrogance works against him here, while Le Chiffre's arrogance is highlighted to make his apparent victory all the more frustrating. Bond's attempt to lash out and murder Le Chiffre is prevented by Leiter, and the entire reason this little moment exists is to contrast it against Le Chiffre poisoning Bond a short while later. It all goes back to that idea of re-establishing how vulnerable Bond is compared to his target. The opening hour of this movie is him bumping off henchmen, which is absolutely in his wheelhouse. But now he's up against a different class of villain. Le Chiffre is potentially cunning enough to beat Bond on a level playing field, but now Bond is having to deal with the likes of Stephen Obarno, poisoning attempts, and whether or not he can trust French spy turned poker game narrator René Mathis. The playing field isn't level. Bond might lose this fight.
Sorry.
It's a really demanding way of making the character seem like he has exploitable weaknesses. In the older movies, this was normally really generic. Bond gets knocked out by a karate chop to the neck and wakes up strapped to an explosive, or a laser, or an exploding laser. Here, the vulnerability is central to the character, so they spend a lot of time establishing it rather than just putting Bond in perilous situations and washing their hands of it. And perhaps the aspect I appreciate most about this scene is that it isn't just used in the present, but is also crucial for later when it highlights the difference between how Bond and Le Chiffre respond to failure. Both opted for violence, though one choosing a knife and the other poison is telling. The movie draws a direct line of comparison between these characters and asks how different they actually are, despite Bond's development. And the answer, I think, is that Vesper Lynd is really the only difference between them, an acknowledgement that makes the final third of Casino Royale much more impactful.
I'm sorry, James.
When Le Chiffre loses, his unwilling response is to weep blood in Bond's presence for the first time, an event that is treated as significant. Never mind that it was set up earlier as something that just sort of happens on its own sometimes, this time it means something apparently. Utterly defeated in cards, unable to get the better of Bond via subterfuge, and without any henchmen left capable of killing him, Le Chiffre plays the one card, excellent play on words Konrad, that he has left. Kidnapping Vesper Lynd. The torture scene that follows is present in both the book and the US television play, although not as explicit as it is here in the case of the latter. Card sense Jimmy Bond never asked Peter Lorre to scratch his balls, as far as I'm aware.
I've got a little itch. Down there. Would you mind?
I love how vicious Mikkelsen comes across in this scene in particular. Any remains of his cool facade have fallen away to reveal the panicked, cowardly man underneath. And there's a really grimy quality to this that stands in contrast to the glitz of the high-stakes poker table. The card game was classic Bond, but now here he is having his genitals beaten with a rope in what looks like a rusted cargo ship, while being taunted about the fact that Le Chiffre could murder him and still probably make a deal with MI6. There's nothing glamorous about any of this. The injuries Le Chiffre deals to Bond are literally emasculating him. He's being robbed of the core element of his identity, which is important for both the spy and his relationship with Vesper after this. And the way this is shot is more reminiscent of an episode of 24 than a Bond movie. But perhaps the most striking thing about this scene is how it ends. There's no escape attempt or violent retribution, just a quick verbal exchange and then a bullet to the dome. Le Chiffre would have killed James Bond in this room if Mr. White hadn't arrived when he did, shooting his former co-worker in the head. And in the deconstruction of Bond's character that Casino Royale attempts, this is in some ways the pinnacle. The first time, to my knowledge, that he has had literally no hand in killing the villain. A scene where he is stripped of his masculine power by humiliating torture and then robbed of a chance to redress the balance by another villain doing it for him. Now, to be honest, the movie does course correct a bit by giving him one big blow-off action scene after this, as he goes after Vesper and the people who coerced her into betraying him. But I don't think that should detract too much from the bold choice they made here. Le Chiffre was a compelling villain, deserving of retribution, and that they were able to rob us of seeing Bond deliver that while still offering not just a satisfying ending, but for my money one of the most satisfying endings of any Bond film, is testimony to how good this movie is. And I think it's crucial here at the end of Le Chiffre's story to remember that while Bond films will always primarily be about the super spy, he is usually only as interesting as the villain opposite him, a character who needs to act as a foil to the new wrinkles a given movie introduces for Bond, and stand in contrast to the hero. And in the case of Casino Royale, Le Chiffre has so many of these wrinkles to oppose. Bond is as complex and layered as we have ever seen him, and a villain who lacked that same complexity would have looked ridiculous by comparison. Maybe the highest compliment I can pay Mikkelsen is to say that, in a movie where anything short of perfection would have made his Le Chiffre stand out for all the wrong reasons, he instead feels like a well-developed and realistic part of a new world for Bond.
It keeps being exciting for some reason. I mean, especially the hand where I win a lot.
And that's Casino Royale and Le Chiffre. Thank you for joining us on Bad Guy Breakdowns again. If you could leave a like, that would be much appreciated. It really does help with the algorithm. And be sure to join us next time. Until then, I've been Konrad, and I will see you next time.